Need to Know, your weekly investment podcast brought to you by the experts at Coutts. I'm Sarah Muir, and I'm joined as always by David Broomfield. Now, David, this week's topic, we have touched on this before in a previous episode. So what is it we're going to talk about, and how are we going to package that into sort of three things?
Hi, Sarah, and hello, everybody. Yes, we talked previously, didn't we, about the rise or the prominence of state-directed, state-designed industrial policy. Now, doesn't that sound exciting?
Yeah, but trust me, listeners, this is actually quite an interesting subject.
Well, I think it's I think it's not only topical, it's very relevant to where we are in both the business cycle and the political cycle, and it's something that's being talked about openly in a way that I've never seen in the last couple of decades. So I think we should definitely explore it, because it's not theoretical, it's here, it's happening. Yeah. And it has happened before as well. So I think that's the context, isn't it? Let's start with the history. And
okay, so just to stop you there, Dave, we're going to talk about industrial policy, aren't we? That's the kind of overarching headline, industrial policy.
Yeah, industrial policy. What is it? The history of it, and why you would do it. Then we've got the relevance to right now, here and now in the cycle and the political cycle, what I just mentioned, where it is definitely something that's featuring very heavily in policy circles, in think tanks, in the media. So let's talk about why now. And then let's bring some market context to it, shall we? And talk about actually how you might implement it, how difficult it is, and what impact it could have across the spectrum.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, let's kick off then with what is industrial policy? What are we talking about? And this is not a new thing, is it?
It's not a new thing. It goes back hundreds of years, and there's plenty of periods where it's rose to prominence, and there's plenty of periods where it's kind of disappeared into the ether. But there's a number of reasons why you might want to direct industrial policy from the center, and you can boil them down really to sort of four main reasons. Okay, you do it to enhance national security by promoting self-sufficiency, and for that you'd look at various key industries, and that's very common in times of war or conflict. And then you might want to support kind of inclusive growth. You might have periods where you've got disenfranchised or perhaps disintermediated parts of the workforce that you want to make sure are benefiting from overall economic growth. So you might target a particular sector. And then, what flows from that is, you're revitalizing. That's the third reason. You're revitalizing left behind communities. Okay. Displaced by various, industry migrations or changes. And then, of course, the fourth reason, which is a bit more nebulous, which is just the optics, the voter optics of doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? And that obviously was quite relevant back in 2016, and is certainly still a feature today, but it's not the only feature.
Yeah. Okay. So first question: is this the same as subsidies, or is this different to subsidies? Is it a little bit more? It sounds like it's a bit more. There's a bit more thought behind it rather than just sort of throwing money at a sector.
Yeah. Well, subsidies are part of it. But potentially, right? I mean, there's lots of different ways. As I said, this is a high level ambition, and actually the policies that you implement to enact it vary very wildly. So subsidies, import substitution, so where you might favor your domestic industry as opposed to importing something, are certainly part of the policies that have been historically employed under that banner of state-directed industrial policy. And they're the areas in particular where economists have the biggest issue. So subsidies and import substitution, because that's where you potentially distort markets and have these sort of suboptimal outcomes. I think I promised we'd look at the history just briefly. If you go back to the 19th century, which where state-directed industrial policy was used quite extensively by the US. You see it particularly after the Civil War, designed to protect key industries and promote domestic industries, particularly in the North when the Civil War was at its peak. And then, you fast forward to the 20th century, and again, it was after the Second World War where it rose to prominence, and you had countries like France really engaged very heavily in state intervention and protectionism. So all those companies which we know today, like Renault or France Telecom, even the French whole nuclear industry, are products of that post-war period of very specific targeted policies by the French government. I think the most recent example, obviously, is China. Yeah, we'll come to that shortly. But you look at countries like South Korea or China, you can see you've had a huge amount of support from the center for a particular strategic sector, and that's really the context of what we're going to be talking about today. On that point of subsidies, so remember my 4 reasons why you might do this. Okay, as a state, you are interested in the potential positive spillovers that you could get from doing this kind of policy. So if you're investing heavily in the automotive sector, there's obviously spillover effects to all the industries that support the automotive sector and the workforce that is engaged in and so you're getting these kind of positive externalities, as economists might call them. But when you go back and look at the history of this, whether it's how Europeans engaged versus the United States in the aerospace industry, because remember, those companies like Boeing and McDonnell Douglas versus sort of Airbus were part of that kind of state-directed policy in the 70s. And then economists have gone back and looked at that period and analyzed all the effects of those things you just described, like subsidies, import substitution, and then netted that off against, well, what were the benefits to consumer welfare? And it's not simple. The conclusion is, if you pick up a microeconomic textbook, all the textbooks that I used to study at university, it will say demonstrably that these kind of policies distort markets and aren't a good idea. And it's simply because the state might not have the best information to direct resources. You've got bureaucracy, you've got crowding out effects, and you've got this kind of moral hazard because firms start to behave in a way that seeks out subsidies and support as opposed to just being competitive. So, it's got a wealth of academic evidence supported by various historical studies that suggest it's not straightforward and it can have a distorting effect. But we know that it can work because there are very specific examples that kind of show that you can do this in a thoughtful way without creating all of that largesse and inefficiency. And that kind of brings us to the relevance of now, I think.
Yeah. And isn't it seen as being a sort of very important for the sort of the East Asian economic miracle, that sort of industrial policy approach for supporting those regions? And is it also not fair to say that it's, well, I mean, you talked about the post-war period, France, but did it go through a period where it went a little bit perhaps out of fashion with developed economies because it was seen as a more authoritarian approach to running the economy, to intervening in the economy?
Yes, the advent of globalization and the Washington Consensus has really kind of suppressed the whole validity of that kind of economic model. Okay, so first of all, your point is that plenty of nations have used it. South Korea, I mentioned a few: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan have prospered massively through leveraging industrial policies, contrary to that belief that it would create inefficiency, et cetera, et cetera. They managed to combine global market integration with those domestic policies to drive structural transformational economic growth. But it fell out of fashion in the late 80s in a material way. The Washington Consensus, the IMF, the World Bank, and the other major US institutions got together and said, well, if we're going to help crisis-driven countries, we're going to impose a basically neoliberal view of the world and the kind of the globalist view of the world, and a set of policies that align to that, which were not industrial policies directed from the center. They were free market policies. So, it fell out of fashion massively as this new consensus around globalization emerged throughout the 90s and into the noughties. And I think it's only recently that you can see that it's again, people are now questioning parts of globalization, not globalization universally, just parts.
Well, we saw that during COVID, didn't we? When we saw that people realized that the global supply chains were fragile when the whole world was impacted by, in this case, a pandemic. And is it fair to say that was the start of the trend, or it was just a kind of a marker along the way in that trend to deglobalization, onshoring work and manufacturing and jobs?
Well, I think the trend was happening anyway. Like all things around COVID, they were massively accelerated because COVID shone a light on working practices, on global trade, supply chain resiliency, healthcare innovation, all kinds of things, and it just quantum leapt them forward. But if you look at the trend was already in motion. So the IMF actually have a working paper out there and a division. Well, I say division; it's a program that track the number of times the term industrial policy is mentioned in the business press. And you can go back every year and look at that trend since the early noughties. So this didn't feature at all in the press really up until 3 or 4 years before COVID. So you had about 6,000 mentions in 2010 in the press sources that the IMF monitor of industrial policy. 2023 had about 16,000 mentions of industrial policy. So the conversation is changing, and it's COVID was part, I think, of accelerating it, but the trend was already there.
Yeah, and so I guess talking about why we're talking about it now, because we've seen now the US is employing it, aren't they?
Well, they are. It's really relevant to the current cycle. I mean, policymakers, as I said, are increasingly recognizing the need for strategies that promote economic resilience, job creation, and that was very much the focus of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was essentially tackling this idea that the US recognized that it used to make about 40% of the semiconductors, the chips in the globe, and now it makes about 10%. And so it makes them and other countries very dependent effectively just on Taiwan that make the bulk of them. So the inflation, and then also there was the parallel to that, which was green technology, solar and renewables and green energy. And China has been progressively cementing itself as the global leader in developing and installing and rolling out of green power generation. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, yes, in the US was exactly designed to promote US semiconductors, US green tech, and a whole green kind of new deal. I mean, you had about 280 billion in the CHIPS Act, and then 39 billion went towards the development of advanced semiconductors. So, okay, these sound like big amounts of money. I mean, they are, but relative to the kind of size of money that is spent in the US economy in any given year, or the size of some of these programs that have existed for decades in other countries, it's a bold step, but it's a small first step towards some kind of direction from the center. So yeah, I mean, it's very relevant now in this post-COVID world, within this current election cycle, political cycle, and within the business cycle as it is as well.
Yeah. And what about Europe? Because I know I read that Mario Draghi has complained that Europe lacks a strategy for how they can sort of shield traditional industries within Europe. because of what everybody else is doing, I guess. I mean, are we seeing sort of an increase in popularity in industrial policy in European countries as well?
Yeah, I mean, this I think is fascinating. In Europe, you would have it would have been inappropriate to talk about this 10, 15 years ago. And now, very recently, actually, in Berlin, you have the Forum New Economy, which is effectively a think tank that brings together economists and policymakers openly, in a very non-controversial way, as I said, as it was in the 80s and 90s, in a very open forum, talking about how Europe can respond with its own set of state-directed industrial policies. So it's very relevant in Europe. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, really, I think, changed the tone in policy circles this side of the Atlantic. It created a precedent that means that these things now can be talked about. And I think, okay, the public by and large aren't microeconomists and perhaps don't understand the detail of how these things can distort markets. But I think when it comes to people's fears in the labor markets of being displaced by not just another region, but maybe AI or technology, I think there's this recognition that perhaps the state should direct policy to make sure that we don't end up with massively annexed communities and left behind communities within the workforce. So it's as I said, the IMF now are tracking this with their new industrial policy observatory. The think tanks and policymakers in Europe are now actively talking about this. It's actually happening. The IMF are tracking not just how many times it's mentioned in the press, they're actually looking at the number of policy interventions that are made across the globe. So in 2023, there were around 2,500 measures, and they have a broad spectrum of measures that constitute industrial policy. You talked about subsidies just as one of those measures. And there's about 1,800 of those 2,500 that the IMF reckon are trade distorting. Okay, so not good. So I think this then goes back to my point of, well, okay, it's happening. More people are talking about it openly. You can make a success out of it, but clearly it's not easy. If the IMF is saying that around 71% of these policies are trade distorting, it's really tough to get it right, I think.
Yeah. And I did see that the IMF have sort of looked at this and have said that actually global growth could drop if without these interventions. They're saying it could drop to 2.8% by the end of the decade, something like that.
Without the interventions, right? Yeah. I mean, you can. There's lots of thinking about the ultimate net effect of this, because if you look at it through that lens of trade distortions, well, that's a kind of deadweight loss, or in the case of tariffs, it's protectionism, which is ultimately inflationary, right? So the consumer pays, and you get this drop in consumer welfare. Or you can look at it through the lens that some thinkers and some think tanks are looking at it through, which is that actually, if you can create this tapestry of global industries which all have their own comparative advantage, but perhaps with some support from their respective states, and you ultimately create you elevate the middle class in all of those respective countries, that actually that's better for global growth than this current situation that we're walking into, which is one of just pure protectionism. So when we get, I think, onto the relevance for markets, this is where it can get really tricky, I think.
Yeah. And before we get onto that, I guess the other risk with the sort of when this policy is used in a counterproductive way or in a negative way is that it does, I mean, you talked about it being inflationary, but it also does increase geopolitical risks as well, doesn't it? If you're employing protectionist policies and trying to exclude other economies from your domestic economy.
Yeah, I mean, it can invite it could invite challenge directly, and you have already seen some of that response, particularly in the automotive industries in EVs. I mean, if you look at BYD, which is the biggest car company that you've probably never heard of,
Yeah, exactly.
and it sells roughly the same number of cars as Tesla every year. It's got a bigger market cap than VW and BMW. And it's very much the product of state-directed industrial policy. And it's quite astonishing. You know, they've just unveiled a vehicle. It's incredible. With 2,000 kilometer range, 2,000 kilometers,
Wow.
for around $14,000, right? I mean, that's the kind of productivity that we haven't seen since Henry Ford. You know, the productivity race, right? The leaps forward in efficiencies and productivity of creating EVs from a state-directed industrial policy. Well, that doesn't align with that description I just made, which is it's bureaucratic and it's potentially wasteful of resource. So you can get it right, but you're 100% right that the very outcome of that policy is now inviting a response, and that response is effectively tariffs. So again, getting it right on both sides of a trading arrangement is key here.
Yeah, I did actually on the subject of BYD. I noticed that they've just sort of expanded in and invested in a car plant in Brazil for something like $10 billion.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of that will be obviously, you know, you've got very quickly growing Latin American economies with young populations. And you're producing a vehicle that is at a price point where it's potentially affordable to the middle class there. But also you've got, getting around various import tariffs by locating your manufacturing plant in a third country. There's some of that. But, you know, we could do a whole podcast on the story of BYD and how Tesla was brought into the Chinese car industry to effectively act as a stalking horse for all of these nascent EV firms in China, of which BYD is probably the most successful, learning all the tricks from Tesla and accelerating itself in the process, probably now beyond Tesla. So, you know, it's been a little bit of a Pyrrhic victory for Elon Musk over there, but you know, it shows you that the ambition here is truly global. And back to your point, that probably invites response from various countries that have fiercely competitive automotive sectors. I mean, obviously, we understand the history of the American automotive sector, but in Europe as well, they're looking at this very closely.
Yeah. Okay. So we're saying now industrial policy. I mean, it's been around for centuries. It went a little bit out. It was, you know, very much employed in the post-Second World War period. Went a little bit out of fashion as we moved into a much more global sort of world economy and everybody kind of working together. And it's come back on the table again. And it's not just China who are engaging in industrial policy. We're seeing it in America, say with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. Okay, so we're going to assume then that industrial policy is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, and we're probably going to see even more of it. What does that mean longer term for markets and investors? And do we have to kind of, how far do we have to extend our horizon before we can start looking at an impact? Are we looking at the next 5 years, next 10 years, next 15 years?
Well, why don't I start this section by saying, well, I just don't know is the honest answer. But
do you have a theory, David?
But well, to your point, it's here to stay, or it's certainly here in a way where it's acceptable to debate it and entertain the policy in a way that it hasn't been for a number of decades. But I think throughout this podcast, I've said at least 3 or 4 times that this is really hard. Okay, so it's really hard from a policy perspective to implement something that isn't trade distorting, that doesn't have a negative welfare effect on the consumer, and achieves what you want it to achieve. So its impact on markets will depend on our ability to execute it in a way that doesn't create all of these negative outcomes, of which, you know, the vast majority of economic history shows you there are negative outcomes here. But you can do it. It's just very, very difficult. So I'll come on to what I think are probably the 3 different outcomes. But let me illustrate just how hard this is. So take the CHIPS Act as an example. and the desire to bring back specific industries into a country, and America's desire to bring back, the number of semiconductors that it produces. Remember, it hasn't invested like this for about 35 years, and the US went from, as I said, producing about 40%, I think, of the world's semiconductor fabrication to around 10%. So bringing back semiconductors to the US is really hard. It's not just a case of government signs a check and everyone just gets on with it. Let me bring it to life. So all of that ecosystem around making chips has developed over decades. It's a truly globalized system that was created with a remarkably benign geopolitical backdrop, right, over 25 years. The supply chain is really complex. So take one of these ASML EUV machines. They're the machines that basically do the lithography. They print the chips.
Okay.
It's one of the most complicated machines we have ever created as a species. And to build a factory to stick one of these machines in takes more concrete than in the Burj Khalifa, the highest skyscraper in Dubai. You need about 5,000 miles of cabling just to wire the building together.
Mind-boggling.
You've got three. Yeah, so I think you've got 100. You need to create a manufacturing environment that is 10,000 times cleaner than the operating theatre in a hospital.
Okay.
So these things are like,
this sounds impossible.
Yeah, it's easier to create a satellite and send it into space or something in the space program than the kind of complexity and the kind of resources you need just to build one chip manufacturing plant. Okay, and then of course you've got all those things that I talked about in the AI podcast about the ecosystem around data centers. It's very similar around the ecosystem for chips. You've got the labor force, the power requirements, and all of those things. So it's really difficult. And that's the challenge. The challenge is you can't just write a check and all of a sudden become a national leader in something. There are huge institutional challenges. You need an expertise. You've got to align that with the global value chain. And then in the process, not create a distortion or some kind of subsidy race. So when we think about the next decade in markets, you asked me for a theory. So I would say that, if I was to theorize, I would say that given that AI and technology and automation might displace a lot of the service sector, that perhaps we might see, interventions in the service sector, and increasing productivity in labor absorbing services, basically. So it's that you might see a new industrial policy for services, and let's think about the impact of markets, I think, through three possible outcomes. I think you've got a good scenario outcome where countries sort of regain some policy autonomy. They foster this middle class that I mentioned, which is great. And then that could create a more cohesive society, which could be beneficial globally. Okay, so that's the surgical precision of some of these policies. Creates improvements in the middle class that benefits everyone together, globally. Then you've got a bad scenario, I suppose, and that's one that we would use history to illustrate. That would be a return to the 1930s style of bilateralism and autarky. So that was post the Great Depression. Everyone wanted to be self-sufficient. What it meant was everything just became really expensive, and you had all of this import substitution, and it was a very suboptimal outcome. And then, of course, you've got the really ugly outcome, which is that everyone responds with protectionism, and that's a zero-sum game. So you get heightening of tensions and a lowering of prosperity. So I'm not sure I've answered the question on what the exact impact would be on markets. I think services are the obvious potential. Well, not the obvious. They're the sector that will potentially be displaced and therefore be a focus potentially of industrial policy. I think that we're going to see more interest in the semiconductor supply chain and resilience, whilst the vast majority of this activity is happening in Taiwan. That just won't be America. That will be other countries as well. But we're talking here about a shift that remember, this shift towards industrial policy started a few years before the pandemic meaningfully, and was accelerated by the pandemic. And what we're talking about today, I think, is the impact on markets over 10 years or so. It's not something that happens overnight.
So if the first scenario, the ideal scenario, is the one that plays out, then there wouldn't be one region that would benefit. Everybody will benefit. Then you wouldn't sort of say, okay, this, developed markets or developing markets, everybody will benefit and all markets will benefit.
Yeah, you should. I think it's about making sure that you're still facilitating global trade and the ability to move capital around the world, but equally you are focused on supporting those areas where you have a comparative advantage. So it's not, this doesn't overrule or in any way contradict the kind of theories of global trade and the law of comparative advantage. It just creates a different dynamic, really, with a particular mutually exclusive sort of focus on a particular industry or particular sector, but still brought together cohesively through a network of global free trade and free movement of capital. So it could benefit everybody, but again, execution risk here is high, really.
Yeah, yeah, because history tells us that it doesn't always work out very well, does it?
History tells us that more often than not, it is used as a political tool.
Yeah,
and that's just to not mince my words, that's subsidies and protectionism, but not always, not always. And as I said, South Korea, even France, and there are many other examples where you can get this absolutely right, and perhaps now with our with the debate changing, I don't think things will lurch back to the way they were. I think now this Berlin meeting of policymakers and economists and the kind of engagement from academia right now is different than what it was. It's talking more about less of absolutes, that it's this or this. It's more about the shades of grey in between, about how it can be implemented and in a complementary way.
Yeah, because that was
optimistic.
Actually. Okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, because that was going to be my question. Is obviously it's without wanting to get into sort of talk about politics, it does rely on a consensus within a given economy, because you don't want to lurch from one strategy to the other within an electoral cycle. So it requires that. And I guess, and so what you're saying, because my other question was going to be, we saw it was in favour, it went out of favour, it's come back into favour again. Is there a risk that it goes out of fashion again?
Possibly. But not, the world, this unipolar world that we had for a couple of decades, which was the backdrop for globalization, just isn't there anymore. We live in a multipolar world with multiple sort of mini geopolitical events happening simultaneously. There's large distortions in various markets that are having now political consequences. So I think there is a desire, a willingness, and a means to do this that didn't exist before. I think it's unlikely that we'll return to that benign policy backdrop of globalization that we had through the 90s into the noughties, because the world's just different. The world has changed.
Yeah. So industrial policy, at the moment, it's here to stay. There is potentially going to be an impact on markets, but we're looking at maybe at least 10 years down the line, because these things take a long time. I mean, just your example of a plant to manufacture semiconductors. I mean, this is a massive undertaking that does not happen overnight and takes a long time and a huge amount of investment to actually get that up and running. But very interesting. Nice to sort of think something a little bit more bigger picture and think about the future. And it's something we're all going to hear more and more about from what you're saying. There's more and more about it in the financial press, and it's definitely something that's kind of starting to become a bit of a topic, and especially in the last couple of years with the some of the policies that we've seen enacted. Thank you very much, David. A reminder that the views expressed in this podcast are not intended to constitute investment advice, are accurate at the time of recording, and are subject to change. Thank you for listening. If you don't already, please subscribe to Need to Know via all the usual platforms where you'll find previous episodes, including one I recorded with Simon Kidston. He's the man behind the sale of the £135 million Mercedes 300 SLR. Check it out if you had never heard of that one before. But he had some very interesting and very forthright views on investing in classic cars. I'm not going to give the game away, but he's not a big fan. Anyway, and also I recently spoke with Kitty O'Shea from Coutts on investing in London prime property. So have a listen to those, and we'll be back next week with more Need to Know. Until then, bye for now.